All right, another major point of contrast has to do with our core status as human beings. One of the things that jumps out at us when we look at this story here in this highly essentialized version that we have here is that once in effect man takes over, and man and woman takes over being independent actors, and it's no longer primarily a story of God as the active agent creating the universe. It's a story that is dominated by sin. Right? And this, of course, in the religious traditions is the doctrine of original sin, but the idea of it is that human beings at their core, at their origin, are essentially bad beings, beings that give in to negative temptations, and so whether they choose to consistently or not, are beings who, left to their own devices, do bad things to the world and to themselves. And the significant thing then is that the stories of the Older Testament are dominated by stories of human beings doing bad things. So is it the case that we think fundamentally that human beings are basically bad beings? That they take the perfectly good world that God has created and thoroughly pollute themselves and thoroughly pollute the world until the only thing that is possible or left to God is a giant cleansing activity. And again, that the cleansing is not something that we would have done ourselves. We would have continued to pollute ourselves and the world. The only cleansing or the only goodness has to come from some non-natural source and be imposed upon us. Now, by contrast, if we look at the morality of human beings in the more naturalistic story, certainly when we tell the story of Homo sapiens going back 200,000 years and the development of all of the cultures and civilizations, there are lots and lots of bad things that happen. There's lots of slavery, there's lots of murder, there's lots of things that we would call sins. But the dominant tenor of this story is not that the sinfulness is dominating the story. Rather, it seems the progressive, the value building, the creating, and the positive is that which is dominating the story. After all, what we have here is human beings with very short life expectancy, in many cases being eaten by other species, and eking out an existence over the course of many years, suddenly having the power to develop metallurgy, to develop agriculture, to increase their wealth, to form cultures that then are complicated. They start to develop technologies and sciences and to write poems and dances, and they then develop all of the apparatus of civilizations, and so they're living wealthier lives, they're living healthier lives, they're living hopefully culturally enriched lives. And if we, on this conception, since it's a purely naturalistic exception, ask who is doing all of this good stuff, well, not every single human being is doing all of this good stuff, but it is human beings who are doing it. And the overall progression is going from short-lived cave dwellers to people living in skyscrapers for many years and enjoying a very culturally enriched life as a possibility. So what we have then is human beings on that interpretation as being more often than not a force for good. So is it the case that the bad dominates the good in human beings, or is it the case that the good dominates the bad in human beings? That's a very different core assessment of what human nature is all about. All right, another, I think, important point of contrast here is that if we look here, human beings seem to be dominated by weakness. Right? Man and woman, when they're in the Garden of Eden, they know that they're not supposed to take God's apple. They know that they're supposed to be obeying God's wishes in this respect here, but they are tempted, and they are not able to resist that temptation, and so they give in to that temptation here. If we jump to this story here of Cain and Abel, Cain probably knows that it's not a good idea to kill his brother in a fit of pique, but nonetheless, in that short-range, intense desire, he can't control himself. He gives in and goes ahead and does so. All the people committing all of the adultery issues and all of the other sins that are going on in the other stories, they probably know, again, that those things are wrong, but nonetheless, they can't control themselves, right, and so forth. So what we then have is a picture of human beings as essentially weak creatures. And also built into this tradition is then a corresponding contrast that any goodness and the real power, right, in the universe does not reside with us as weak human beings, intellectually and morally, but rather with God. So what we have then is a corresponding diminishment, right, of the competence and power of human beings, and a corresponding augmentation of the power of God. So in this case here, and it's certainly a morally significant point and relevant to our fifth point here, do we see human beings as essentially weak creatures, right? Left to our own devices, we aren't going to do the good, but also God really is the author, right, of this whole story, and human beings are playing a role in this script that God has created here. But it really is God who is driving the car, so to speak, or navigating the ship. He has created the overall structure, and He is the power. We are then just more or less along for the ride to play whatever limited role has been assigned to us in this case here. Now, by contrast here, this naturalistic conception does not see things as happening as a result of divine agency, and certainly there are lots of very powerful physical forces at work in the universe, but ultimately what happens and how those forces are used is in large measure going to play out rather as a result of the choices that we make. And we can make choices in economics, in politics, in the arts, in the humanities, and so forth, to go in this direction or in that direction. And so we have the power then to do what we want, to create our civilizations in whatever direction that we want to do. And that seems to indicate that human beings, while not all powerful, do have a great measure of control, a great measure of power over their destinies, and how they choose it is a significant portion of what's ultimately going to happen here. Down here, by contrast, it seems to be that God has a plan, and how the plan is going to work out is largely already set or entirely already set as a result, and so we might be able to adjust things a little bit here and there on a very micro scale, but the macro scale is full speed ahead, and it's going to play out just as God has scripted it. Here, the script is largely under our control, and so we can write it how we wish.